The forest was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. It was late October, and the air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and decaying wood. The moon hung low, casting an eerie silver glow over the landscape. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, but even that sound felt wrong, like a warning. Emily had always loved the woods. She'd grown up hiking these trails, exploring every nook and cranny of the dense forest. But tonight something felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her flashlight flickered as she walked, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. She shook it and the light steadied, but the unease in her chest remained. She wasn't alone. At first she thought it was her imagination, a trick of the shadows maybe. But then she heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It was something else. Something raw. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The growl came again, closer this time, and she could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly turned, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The beam of her flashlight danced across the trunks, but there was nothing there. And then she saw it. Glowing golden eyes reflecting the light like a predator's. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal she knew. The creature stepped into the clearing and Emily's blood ran cold. It was massive, standing at least 7 feet tall on 2 muscular canine legs. Its fur was a patchwork of black and gray, matted and dirty, and its snout was twisted into a snarl, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. But the worst part was its eyes. They were intelligent, calculating, and filled with a malice that made Emily's stomach churn. The Dogman tilted its head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. Emily's legs felt like they were made of lead, but she forced herself to take a step back. The creature mirrored her movement, its claws digging into the soft earth as it advanced. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice trembling. She raised her flashlight like a weapon, but the Dogman only let out a low, rumbling laugh that sent chills down her spine. It lunged. Emily screamed, diving to the side as the creature's claws slashed through the air where she had just been standing. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart pounding in her ears. The forest blurred around her as she sprinted, branches whipping at her face and arms. She could hear the Dogman behind her, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground as it gave chase. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Her lungs burned and her legs felt like they were on fire, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. And then she saw it, a cabin. It was old and dilapidated, with broken windows and a sagging roof, but it was shelter. Emily didn't think twice. She threw herself through the door, slamming it shut behind her and fumbling with the lock. The wood was rotten and the door felt flimsy, but it was better than nothing. The Dogman slammed into the door with a force that made the entire cabin shake. Emily backed away, her eyes wide with terror as the creature snarled and clawed at the wood. The door wouldn't hold for long. She looked around the cabin, desperate for something, anything she could use to defend herself. There was an old fireplace with a rusted poker leaning against it. She grabbed it, her hands shaking as she held it out in front of her. The door splintered, and the Dogman's snarling face appeared through the gap. Its golden eyes locked onto hers, and it let out a bone-chilling howl that echoed through the night. Emily tightened her grip on the poker, her mind racing. She didn't know if she could fight it off. She didn't know if she would survive the night. But one thing was certain. The Dogman wasn't going to let her go without a fight. The Dogman's claws tore through the door like it was made of paper. Emily's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she gripped the rusted fireplace poker, her knuckles white. The creature's golden eyes glowed in the dim light of the cabin, and its snarl was a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. The door gave way with a splintering crash, and the Dogman stepped inside. Its massive frame filled the doorway, its fur bristling and its teeth bared. Emily backed into a corner, her mind racing. She had no plan, no escape route, just the poker in her hands and the desperate will to survive. The Dogman lunged. Emily swung the poker with all her strength, the metal connecting with the creature's snout. It let out a yelp of pain and stumbled back, shaking its head. For a moment, Emily felt a flicker of hope. But it was short-lived. The Dogman recovered quickly, its eyes narrowing with a terrifying intelligence. It wasn't just an animal, it was something far more cunning. It circled her, its claws scraping against the wooden floor. Emily's heart pounded as she realized it was toying with her, waiting for the right moment to strike. She glanced around the cabin, searching for anything that could help her. Her eyes landed on a broken window, the glass long gone. If she could just get to it, maybe she could climb out and make a run for it. But the Dogman was between her and the window, its gaze never leaving her. The creature lunged again, and this time, Emily wasn't fast enough. Its claws raked across her arm, sending a searing pain through her body. She cried out, dropping the poker as she fell to the floor. The Dogman loomed over her, its breath hot and rancid as it leaned in close. Emily's vision blurred as she stared up at the creature, her mind racing. She couldn't die here. Not like this. Summoning the last of her strength, she kicked out with her legs, catching the Dogman in the chest. It stumbled back, giving her just enough time to scramble to her feet. She bolted for the window, ignoring the pain in her arm. The Dogman roared behind her, but she didn't look back. She dove through the window, landing hard on the ground outside. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she forced herself to keep moving. The forest was a blur as she ran, her legs burning with every step. She could hear the Dogman behind her, its growls growing louder as it closed the distance. Emily's mind raced. She needed a plan, a way to lose it. But the woods were endless, and the creature was relentless. And then she saw it, a narrow ravine, its steep sides covered in thick underbrush. Without thinking, she veered toward it, hoping the Dogman wouldn't follow. She slid down the slope, her hands clawing at the dirt to slow her descent. At the bottom, she crouched behind a fallen tree, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Dogman stopped at the edge of the ravine, its glowing eyes scanning the darkness. Emily held her breath, praying it wouldn't see her. For a moment, the creature hesitated, its head tilted as if listening. Then, with a final snarl, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Emily didn't move. She stayed hidden, her body trembling as she waited for the sound of the Dogman's footsteps to fade. When she was sure it was gone, she finally let herself breathe. But the relief was short-lived. She was alone in the woods, injured and miles from help. The Dogman was still out there, and it knew she was here. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, Emily knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not yet. The forest was no longer quiet. The howls of the Dogman echoed through the trees, distant but persistent. Emily knew it was still out there, hunting her. Her arm throbbed where the creature's claws had torn through her skin, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But she couldn't stop. Not now. She stumbled through the underbrush, her breath ragged and her mind racing. The ravine had bought her some time, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The Dogman was relentless, and it wouldn't stop until it found her. She needed to get out of the woods, but the trees seemed to stretch on forever, their twisted branches closing in around her like a cage. And then she saw it, a faint light in the distance. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of her exhausted mind. But as she moved closer, the light grew brighter, flickering like a flame. Hope surged in her chest as she pushed herself forward, ignoring the pain in her body. The light led her to a small clearing where an old, weathered cabin stood. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the windows glowed with a warm, inviting light. Emily hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious. But the howls of the Dogman were growing louder, and she had no other choice. She ran to the door and pounded on it with her fists. "Please, help me," she cried, her voice breaking with desperation. The door creaked open and an elderly man peered out. His face was lined with age and his eyes were sharp and piercing. He took one look at Emily and stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Hurry," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's not safe out there." Emily stumbled inside, collapsing onto a wooden chair by the fire. The warmth of the flames was a welcome relief, but her heart was still pounding. The old man closed the door and locked it, then turned to face her. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Emily nodded, too exhausted to speak. The old man sighed and sat down across from her, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It's been hunting these woods for years," he said. "Some say it's a curse, others say it's a demon. But one thing's for sure, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." Emily's blood ran cold. "What does it want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man looked at her, his expression grim. "You." Before Emily could respond, a loud crash came from outside. The dogman's howl pierced the air, and the walls of the cabin shook as the creature slammed against them. The old man stood, his face hardening. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a shotgun from the wall. "Don't open the door for anyone." Emily watched in horror as he unlocked the door and stepped outside, the shotgun raised. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, followed by the dogman's enraged roar. She wanted to help, but her body refused to move. She was frozen in place, her mind racing with fear. The gunfire stopped and the woods fell silent. Emily held her breath, waiting for the old man to return. But the door remained closed, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. And then she heard it, a low guttural growl right outside the door. Emily's heart stopped. The door handle began to turn, slowly and deliberately. She backed away, her eyes fixed on the door as it creaked open. The dogman stepped inside, its golden eyes glowing in the firelight. Its fur was matted with blood, and its teeth were bared in a snarl. Emily's mind screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The creature lunged, and everything went black. Emily's world was a blur of darkness and pain. She could feel the dogman's hot breath on her face, its claws digging into her shoulders as it pinned her to the ground. She struggled, but her strength was gone. Her vision flickered, and she could feel herself slipping away. But then a voice cut through the chaos. "Enough." The dogman froze, its grip on Emily loosening. She gasped for air, her vision clearing just enough to see the old man standing in the doorway, his shotgun aimed at the creature. His face was pale and his hands were trembling, but his eyes were steady. "I said enough," he repeated, his voice firm. The dogman let out a low growl, its golden eyes narrowing as it turned to face the old man. For a moment, the two of them stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, with a final snarl, the creature released Emily and backed away. Emily scrambled to her feet, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion. She stumbled toward the old man, who kept his shotgun trained on the dogman. "Get behind me," he said, his voice low and urgent. Emily obeyed, her eyes never leaving the creature. The dogman watched them, its gaze filled with a mixture of anger and something else, something almost like regret. Then, with a final bone-chilling howl, it turned and disappeared into the night. The old man lowered his shotgun and let out a long, shaky breath. "It's gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling. What was that?" she asked, her voice breaking. The old man sat down beside her, his face grim. "That," he said, "was my son." Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. "Your son?" The old man nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Years ago there was an accident. He was bitten by something unnatural. It changed him, turned him into that. I've spent years trying to find a way to cure him, but nothing works. He's not the boy I raised anymore. He's a monster." Emily's heart ached for the old man, but her fear was still too fresh. "Why didn't it kill me?" she asked. The old man sighed. "Because he's still in there somewhere. The boy I raised. He doesn't want to hurt anyone, but the beast, it's too strong. It takes over." Emily looked out the window where the dogman had disappeared into the woods. "What happens now?" she asked. The old man shook his head. "Now you leave, and you don't come back. This forest isn't safe for anyone anymore." Emily nodded, her mind still spinning. She wanted to say something, to thank the old man, to offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood and made her way to the door. As she stepped outside, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. The forest was quiet, the howls of the dogman replaced by the gentle chirping of birds. Emily took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling her lungs. She didn't look back.